I have not used before.
It makes streaming much easier, and it's supposed to work much better. It's all right. I'm just going to say hi to everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm sure you already read Professor Bueno de Mesquita's Wikipedia page, and thank you so much for coming. I was also told to remind everyone that to subscribe and to like the thing. I know there are only 3 people who aren't in the club and follow us, but still 3 people is always better. All right, so I think I'll go to the first question. Just let me open the email. Okay, so our first question is, what advice would you give to young wannabe politicians?
Oh, I have sad advice. Most people who go into politics go in thinking that they have principles and they have ideas that they want to advance and policies and so forth. And that's great. I mean, it's great to go into politics for that reason, but that is not the path to success in politics. To succeed in politics, you have to do what the people who support you have to want you to do. And that, unfortunately, means principles go out the window very quickly for successful politicians. Cicero, or since you guys are in Italy, Cicero's brother, Quintus Tullius, advised him when he ran for consul of Rome that he should lie to the people he spoke to always tell them what they want to hear, tell them that he's really their friend looking out for them, and say the opposite to the next group. He said, point out the sexual depravities of your opponent. Doesn't matter if it's true, as long as somebody believes it. That's an extra vote for you. And sadly, that is cynically the way politics works. It is about getting people to continue to support you, not because of your ideas, but because they think you agree with what they want.
Perhaps I could pass. It's rather interesting because we always tend to think that the concept of a negative vote, as in trying to not make other people who support your opponent vote, we always think it's a new concept, but actually it seems like it's a rather old concept. So I'm just going to pass to the second question. Well, could you tell us a bit more about Chapter 8, or the people in revolt? In particular, actually, all of us read this article that said that about 3% of the population is necessary, as in if 3% of the population of a given country protest, usually change is enacted. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the people's revolt, or the people in revolt.
So what article was this?
I think I'll have to send it to you later. I think it's in foreign policy.
There's no magic number. 3% doesn't miraculously lead to revolt or successful revolt. One of the areas that my co-author Alistair Smith and I have really built on since writing the Dictator's Handbook in our academic research is in the question of revolt and also coup d'etat. So let me say briefly how we are currently thinking about it. First of all, we believe, and for reasons I'll explain in a moment, that predicting what causes a revolt is a fool's errand. And the reason is it's a fool's errand, is except for a few very, very odd circumstances. If we can anticipate the conditions that lead to a revolt, if 3% of the people protest, for example, if we can anticipate it, so can the members of the winning coalition, and so can the incumbent leader. And if you're a member of the winning coalition and you anticipate that there's going to be a revolt, there are 3 things you can do in response. You can back the incumbent leader and crush the revolt. You're going to do that if you think the incumbent is going to remain in power and continue to be paying you. If, on the other hand, the incumbent leader is very sick, so you think that the leader is going to die soon, or very, very old. So again, the leader, that's, terminal illness, the leader is going to die soon, and so forth. Then you can either throw your support behind the revolt or launch a coup to preempt the revolt. So, for example, in the Arab Spring 2011, in Egypt, the military sat on its hands, allowing the revolt to take place. Joined the revolt, deposed Mubarak, joined the new government, and then a few months later launched a coup d'etat and overthrew it. If you are going to join with the rebellion, the army did that as well in 1979. They sat on their hands because they knew the Shah of Iran was dying, and they didn't support him. So if you sit on your hands, or if you plot a coup, the leader is going to as well be thinking that you might do those things if you haven't come out and helped the leader. So the leader, just as we are anticipating 3%, whatever, there's going to be a revolt. The coalition anticipates there's going to be a revolt. They choose back the leader, launch a coup, back the revolt. And the incumbent as well anticipates the problem. And the incumbent has a set of appropriate responses. So if the leader is in good health, and likely to remain, and some in the coalition are believed to be plotting a coup, purges are the right way to go. So you shrink the coalition, you increase the private rewards to those who are loyal to you to make them more loyal. They then will expose their colleagues who are plotting a coup. You get rid of them, you stay in power, and you become more autocratic. Or if you're not in such good health, or a bunch of other conditions, you increase public goods, the quality of life for the people, neutralizing the incentive to revolt because people are getting benefits, and so they continue to support you. And while, of course, that means that you're producing more public goods, there's less money left over to steal. You're going to be dead pretty soon. That's why you're doing this. So the key is to survive in power as long as you can. It's the next guy's problem. And of course, if you produce more public goods, you have to increase the size of your coalition to be in equilibrium, aligned with the proportion of public goods that you're allocating. And you reform the government then, and you become more democratic. You do that, for example, if you've run out of money for bribing people. J.J. Rawlings did that in Ghana many years ago in 1992. Country was bankrupt. He couldn't pay the military. His only solution was to democratize. He did. He got elected twice, and then he stepped down and lived out his life quite successfully and peacefully and heroically. So the key is, revolts don't happen in isolation. Anything that we can predict with this 3% or whatever, so can the people who will be adversely affected by the revolt. And therefore, most of the time, plotted revolts don't happen. They happen either because somebody miscalculates, in which case there's not a magic number like 3%. There's some noisy process. Either they miscalculate or they simply don't have the resources to respond.
So practically, we were talking about, right now we're talking about the Real Selectorate. More or less, we're talking about the Real Selectorate. And I was just wondering, how is it possible to align the interests of the Real Selectorate and these people want to keep power in a democracy? Like, how do we align these interests? Or is it possible to align these interests?
That's a great question. The interests of leaders is strictly decreasing as coalition gets bigger. The interests of the general selectorate, the nominal selectorate, the people and the disenfranchised, strictly, it's asymptotic, but it's strictly increasing as the coalition gets bigger. So they have opposite interests. But the members of the winning coalition, the essentials, their welfare, let's see if I can get on the screen. It looks like the Nike logo, like the Nike swoosh. It looks like that. So you don't have to align all three groups' interests. You do have to align enough interests to come to and stay in power. So what's happening is the coalition gets bigger as we move from my thumb to my index finger. The coalition is getting bigger, and the welfare of the coalition is changing just like this. It's first, it's going down because you are getting fewer private rewards. Gradually, it turns up slowly, and eventually there's this dividing line, right, where the maximum over here reaches a cut point, and above that is strictly democratic. Below that, you have coups, revolutions, civil wars, all sorts of unpleasant things, and instability. What a leader has to do is align the leader's interests with the interests of the coalition members. The welfare of the people, sadly, is of no importance to the leader. It only becomes of consequence when you need a really big coalition. If you need a really big coalition, then the interests of the coalition and of the people are aligned, because you're mostly going to be spending resources producing public goods, good public policy, rather than private goods. The coalition and the people's interests are aligned in democratic systems, and they are aligned against the interests of the leader. So in democratic political systems, leaders don't do nearly as well as in autocracies, monarchies, and so forth. And if the coalition is small enough, the interests of the coalition and the leader is aligned, but not the people. But the people are only incidental. If you're not essential to keeping somebody in power, whatever you're getting is just the good luck of whatever public goods have to be produced. So they don't need to be aligned.
One of the things that comes to mind, especially when reading the first part of the book, well, actually also in the second part, is that it's almost implied that the military has a huge role. Because if you think of a real selectorate and you think of different pillars, the military, the civil-military relation, well, that relation in a democracy becomes very interesting and very important. I was just wondering if you had other thoughts on the aspects or the civil-military relations. I'm not sure if it was clear.
Yeah, it's a very important question. I have, for decades, pondered the question why it is in mature democracies that the military doesn't interfere more overtly in politics. The standard answer is it's norms, it's culture. These are hand waves. It has no logical foundation. Or at least if it has a logical foundation, I haven't seen it written out. It's either true by assumption, in which case it's a tautology, or I want to see a logical proof of why that would be. In my world, a norm is equilibrium behavior that is stabilized because you'd be worse off if you did something else. This is a mystery that is calling for somebody to do much more serious research than has been done. There is a lot of research on it, but it's not the kind of research that I value anyway. The key to power in most societies is a mixture of three groups of people. The senior military, because they have the guns. The senior civil service, because they manage where the money is. And senior family or fellow religious or whatever.
May I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I was just really curious because I think it was yesterday we had Professor Krastev with The Light That Failed, and he was talking about some classes, for example, lawyers, professors, and he was saying that those are part of this really important selectorate. I was just really curious to not hear you say that. Just wondering why that would be.
So I don't think that professors and lawyers are super important. They become important in, particularly lawyers, in more democratic societies and larger coalition societies, because those societies rely on rule of law. That's a critical public good. And so you need people who understand and can interpret the law. Professors come and go in importance. First of all, political leaders choose to surround themselves with professors who agree with them. So the professorial role is decorative. It's not critical. It's not, oh, wow, what an insight. I didn't know that. Now I understand what I should do things. No, it's finding people who will give credence to what you already believe. There's a wonderful paper by a political scientist named Randall Calvert, Calvert. The title is something like Unbiased Information. I don't remember the exact title. The paper's mid-1980s. I'm going to guess around 1984. I believe the American Journal of Political Science. The basic gist of it's a mathematical model, so it's not something most people will want to read, but the basic gist of the article is very straightforward. Calvert starts with the observation that a lot of leaders surround themselves with what we call yes men, people who always agree with them. And we all look at that and think that's a really, really unfortunate thing. It's a terrible mistake. You should hear different points of view. And he provides a logical explanation for why the hearing many points of view idea is wrong, and why you should surround yourself with yes men. And it's very straightforward. So suppose you and I routinely disagree about things. And so you ask me a question, you have an opinion about it, and I disagree with you. Well, there's no information in the fact that I disagree with you. You already know I disagree with you about most things. I look at the world differently. So you pretty much discount or ignore what I've had to say. We had the example during the Vietnam War that George Ball routinely disagreed with Lyndon Johnson about Vietnam policy, and Lyndon Johnson just paid no attention because, yeah, of course, I can tell people I've heard these other opinions. George Ball never agrees with me. We don't think alike. On the other hand, if you have somebody who almost always agrees with you, who then disagrees, there's real information there. Then you think, oh, maybe I have to reconsider how I've thought about this, because this is a person who thinks the way I do, and they've come to the opposite conclusion. Maybe I don't have this right. So Lyndon Johnson brought Clark Clifford into his administration. Clark Clifford was a very old, long-standing friend of Lyndon Johnson's, Texas politician. They thought alike. They liked each other. They saw the world the same way. And Clark Clifford had supported Johnson's Vietnam policy. And then when he came to Johnson, he said, Lyndon, Vietnam is going to destroy you. You've got to reconsider. Well, when George Ball said that, yeah, there's no information. But when Clark Clifford said that, I better think this through again. He thinks the way I do. So yes men, when they disagree, are informative. People who disagree, when they disagree, are uninformative. And when they happen to agree with you, it's also uninformative because you've already got your belief. So you only learn when you hear something inconsistent with what you expected. This is Bayes' rule. You learn when somebody says something you didn't anticipate they were going to say, hence surrounding yourself with yes men. I don't remember anymore what the question was that set me off on that, but there it is.
Oh, you answered it. So practically, the military doesn't wake up and take over democracies because of norms, and yes men are good.
Yeah, so I mean, part of the answer, I think, in the case of the military in democracies or in any place, is, after all, it's much like the answer I gave to the revolt question. The prime minister or the president or the king or the dictator or whoever it is needs the military to protect them and the nation. And they know that the military are the people with the guns. So they know the people who protect them are also the people who could kill them. So they adopt policies that the military finds acceptable and appealing, if that way they don't get shot. So if we think about that in the context of a mature democracy like the United States, so the president and all the leadership is surrounded by people with guns all the time. In the United States, everybody is surrounded with people with guns. Now, the military generals, relative to their skills, are not very well paid. On the other hand, the military budget is probably quite a bit larger than it needs to be for national security. Retired senior military officers often go to work as consultants with the government. And there are firms set up just for them to ensure that, so they have the implicit promise of a future income stream to make up for the years of economic sacrifice, or at least partially make up. So one could tell a story, but it is only a story, that they are sufficiently compensated that they remain loyal, and if they weren't, maybe they wouldn't. It still leaves the puzzle, how much is enough, and so on.
I'm being pushed to ask the third question that we had agreed on. Well, so the third question is, how would you respond to those who say that the theory is over-reductionist?
So, I've heard this statement. I don't understand the question. The sense in which I don't understand the question is the following. There is an empirical record. That is, the theory has been tested. In fact, Alistair and I have come up with a much better measure of coalition size recently. So we're retesting, getting incredibly strong results. So the question becomes, can you get equally good empirical results in explaining past behavior and predicting future behavior across as wide a sample of dependent variables, of things of interest, with a less reductionist theory? If you can, great. I haven't seen it. And if you can with a more reductionist theory, great. I haven't seen it. From my point of view, when we talk about, for example, states' foreign policy, Italy's foreign policy, United States foreign policy, Russia's foreign policy, Belgium's foreign policy, this is a metaphor. States don't have policies, people have policies. So I don't understand the notion even that this is overly reductionist. Overly reductionist to me, I have friends who are interested in studying political behavior at the level of genes or chemicals. That feels a little over reductionist to me. But if they show really good empirical results, great. It's a mistake, in my view, to question theory on the grounds of its assumptions, because assumptions are stipulations about the state of the world. They are not empirical statements. Theory is about what is implied by the combination, the coexistence of assumptions, how they interact with each other, And explanatory power is derived by seeing how well those implications are met in the real world, both past and predictively. And in my biased view, the Selectorate theory does a really good job. So it seems to me to be just the right amount of reductionism.
The fourth question would be my question, actually. So it's what role do you give chance in your theory? I thought of the question because when reading Machiavelli, I remembered that he talks about banks and rivers and how we always have to build small, I'm not sure if I can call them, banks or small dams to block the river, and then if it overflows, it happens. So it's an important part of political theory, I think. So the role of chance would be my question.
So the political world, like all worlds, is noisy. Of course, there are chance events. The question is, how important are the chance events? And so I'm going to divide them into two categories. The general statement is the same answer as to the reductionism question. It's an empirical question. How well does a theory fit what happens? If it fits well, then the role that chance plays is relatively small. If it's very noisy, it doesn't fit well, then chance plays a big part. The second answer is that, so the Selectorate theory is derived from game theory models. There are, get a little technical, there are what are called stochastic elements in game theory, that is, shocks that occur. So in the more recent work that Alistair and I have done, and of course the theory originated with four of us, Randy Severson and Jim Morrow as well, and they continue to do stuff as well. But in recent work, Alistair and I have looked at what happens when an incumbent leadership faces any one of or combination of three different sources of shock. A health shock, that is the expectation that the incumbent leader is going to survive, has been shaken up. So I'll come back to that. And a revenue shock. The income flow to the government has faced a sudden shock. If you're an oil state and the world goes to electric cars, well, that wouldn't be a shock. That's happening gradually. On the other hand, if today the price of a barrel of oil is $60 and tomorrow it's $20 because something happened, well, that's a shock. That's going to fundamentally alter the revenue of oil states, and economic shocks, global downturns, pandemic, so on. So health shocks matter because the foundation of the theory is that coalition members, the essentials, remain loyal to the incumbent in exchange for the expectation that they will get more private benefits from the incumbent than they can get by defecting to somebody else. Well, that stops being true if you wake up one day and you discover that the incumbent has had a massive heart attack and is expected to die. That person can't pay you anymore, so you have to shop around and find another leader. Or if you look around at leaders who've been overthrown over the last few decades, once you make it past the first roughly 2 years in office as an autocrat, you pretty much stay in power until you die in your sleep or you are believed to be gravely ill. Ferdinand Marcos was overthrown in the Philippines when he was known to have an advanced case of lupus. He died a couple of years later. The Shah of Iran was overthrown when he was known to have a serious case of cancer. Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire was overthrown when he was believed to have a serious case of cancer. So if we look at somebody like Vladimir Putin today, so Putin likes to take holidays doing physically very strenuous activities, and he likes to be filmed doing them. He likes to take off his shirt and go horseback riding, go hunting, play hockey, and so forth. He is demonstrating, don't mess with me. I'm in good health. Don't think I'm going to be dying soon and can't pay you. Stay loyal. I can take care of you. Robert Mugabe, he died at 95, was deposed a year before. Robert Mugabe used to like to say, my doctor tells me I have the bones of a 20-year-old. That is, so a chronic illness or sudden acute illness, these are shocks. These are chance events. And those chance events have calculable consequences. So some chance is just noise, poor fit, and some chances is you don't know when the event will occur, but you can predict what its consequences will be. If there's a sudden drop in the price of oil, so I can't pay my military anymore, well, that may be a problem. On the other hand, my rival faces the same economic revenue shock, so my rival can't pay any better than I can pay. But if, for example, I've had a sudden loss of intellectual power due to some chance event, I got hit in the head, my rival can do better because I may have lost some competence. So some elements of shock can be modeled, of chance can be modeled and have been, and some are just noise in the system. The noise in the system must be relatively unimportant or the theory wouldn't fit the data so well. And the elements that are predictable, these are things, there's just more complicated modeling, but that they're standard methods for doing, for addressing.
While you were explaining or trying to answering the question, two other questions came to mind. So first of all, I was wondering if you could give us some concrete examples of how democratic leaders consolidate power. That would be the first question. And the second question...
I missed the last part of the question. How democratic leaders...
How democratic leaders try to consolidate power.
Sure. If we look around Europe, we barely find two places with the same electoral rules. The choice of electoral rules is itself an effort to manipulate political outcomes. There's a very influential theorem by Kenneth Arrow, sadly died a few years ago, the Arrow theorem. Arrow's theorem tells us that if we make four basic assumptions, people can prefer whatever they want, calls it universal domain. People have socially transitive preferences. If I like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla and vanilla better than strawberry, then I like chocolate better than strawberry. And if society likes chocolate better than vanilla and society likes vanilla better than strawberry, then society should like chocolate better than strawberry. But it turns out that's easily violated. If we face a set of choices and we unanimously, everybody prefers choice A to choice B, we should choose A. Unanimity principle. And Pareto, independence from irrelevant alternatives, if society prefers A to B, and then we introduce a third choice, C, in 2000, majority of voters, plurality of voters, preferred Al Gore for president to George W. Bush. And then we introduced Ralph Nader. So no chance that Ralph Nader was going to be elected president. He was the irrelevant alternative. So A was preferred to B. We introduced this irrelevant alternative C, and now B is preferred to A. Okay, so Arrow's theorem says we shouldn't have indifference to irrelevant alternatives. If A was preferred to B, introducing C shouldn't change it to B being preferred to A, and so on. His four conditions are logically inconsistent with each other. That is, they cannot coexist. And what he establishes is that it is not possible to create a rule for adding up people's preferences for voting that satisfy his 4 conditions of fairness. So the job of politicians is to get elected, so they try to manipulate the rules. I live in New York City. New York City has just switched from plurality voting to ranked voting. Ranked voting is becoming very popular in the United States.
Is ranked voting the Australian system where you put 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yeah. So you rank the candidates. There are many variants of ranked voting. You could do what's called a board account, where you weight the rankings. Lots of things you could do. But anyway, people naively think that's going to produce a fairer result. It just produces a different result. Germany uses a proportional representation system. Many people think, that's fairer because you represent many more points of view. Of course, to pass a law in the legislature, you need a majority of the vote. So it doesn't matter how you got there. So rank voting, proportional representation, they're not fairer. They just are different. In my courses I teach, I give the example. It's a nice, convenient example. It's getting out of date. The 1992 presidential election in the United States had 3 serious candidates. It had Bill Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Ross Perot. Bill Clinton won 43% of the popular vote. George Herbert Walker Bush won 38%, and Ross Perot won 19%. And we know about 2/3 of Ross Perot's supporters preferred Bush to Clinton, but there wasn't ranked voting. So in a plurality election, which won't get into the details of the Electoral College, but in a plurality election, clearly Clinton won. He had more votes than anybody else. If the United States used the French runoff system, George Herbert Walker Bush would have been elected president. If we used a particular ranked voting called a board account, so if we have 3 candidates, I give my first choice 2 points, I give my second choice 1 point, I give my third choice no points, Ross Perot would have been elected president. So of course, if you can pick the voting rule, you're going to pick the rule that works for you.
So you're saying that in almost every democracy, one of the first tools to consolidate power is gerrymandering by other means.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So people at least in the United States seem to think that gerrymandering is a recent idea. Gerrymandering is named after Eldridge Gerry. Eldridge Gerry was vice president of the United States in 1812. In 1810, he was the governor of Massachusetts, and he introduced gerrymandering, the rearranging of districts, so his party would win. It was, very, very, and that's of course what it still is. In many states in the United States, in almost all states, there are sore loser laws. So what a sore loser law says is if I run in a primary to be chosen by a political party to be its candidate, if I lose, I'm not allowed to run in the general election on another party ticket. Of course, turnout in primaries is very low. So it might be that I was not popular with the 5% who voted in the primary, but I was much more popular with the 70% who voted in the general election. So it might be that I would easily win the general election, but lose in the primary. Well, so sore loser laws are a way of shrinking the coalition. In the new edition of the Dictator's Handbook that will be out next year, we have a new chapter on democracy, and we go through, in the context of the United States, how small you could make the winning coalition. So, for example, the Constitution stipulates that the state legislature in each state determines how the electors for the Electoral College are chosen. Now, of course, Americans think that they have the right constitutionally to vote for president. They don't. That's not in the Constitution. That's the way things have been done, and that's the way state legislatures have legislated it, but they can change it. As late as 1828, there were 2 states where the state legislature simply picked the electors of the Electoral College. The voters had 0 say. So imagine that the state legislators pick the Electoral College. Well, now you've really reduced the set of people who have a say to a much, much smaller set than is currently true. And there are lots of ways you could make that smaller. I mean, if you move into the world of rigged elections, so in each state, there is either a Secretary of State or a commission that certifies the vote. So if they say whatever they feel like, if 26 state secretaries of state say X won, even though Y won the vote, well, X would be the president. Right? Now you got a winning coalition of 26, sort of the size that you get in North Korea. So there are lots of ways to shrink who you need. Alistair, Jim Morrow, and Randy Severson and I did a paper for the World Bank a number of years ago on Tanzania, when people still thought that Tanzania was a democracy. They have awakened, but we didn't think it was a democracy back then. So the Tanzanian political system, the rules for election look very much like the Westminster rules. So the prime minister is the head of the party that controls half the parliament plus 1, much like in Italy. Italy, another place that has greatly rigged elections through not by cheating on counting votes, but in structuring how it's done. So in Tanzania, we know from something called Duverger's law that if you have a first past the post, winner take all election system like the Westminster system, things should get reduced to 2 serious political parties, because the third party is going to get nothing. So the people who support the third party ought to vote for whichever party is closer, of the bigger parties, is closer to their point of view. But in Tanzania, there were 15 political parties. There still are, I think, 15. Why is that? Well, it turned out that the Tanzanian system was set up to ensure that the Chama cha Mapinduzi party, the main dominant party, the CCM, didn't actually need a lot of votes to win, because there were, in any given district, an average of 10 parties running per district. They would be dividing up all the vote, and so you only had to beat the second largest party, which often didn't have more than 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% of the vote. And so they could win handily. There are just lots of ways, while counting votes fairly, to make sure that things swing your way. And the competition in democracy is that the other guy's trying to do that too. So it often balances out. But yeah, there are ways to shrink the coalition.
I think I should pass to my next given question. Oh, geez. Well, actually, I think I'd like to ask you something else before that, if I may. I was really shocked to hear that you said ranked voting isn't fair.
No, I didn't say it isn't fair. I said it's not fairer. It doesn't match what people want any better. But that's the arrow result. The arrow result is that if you agree that his 4 conditions, universal domain, socially transitive preferences, unanimity, and indifference to irrelevant alternatives, that if those four things are critical to taking individual votes, adding them up to what society wants, no rule can be constructed that guarantees satisfying those four conditions. That doesn't mean in this or that election you won't satisfy them, but you can't know. What it does mean is that there is no, when you don't know what issues will come up in the future, there is no rule that will always satisfy those four conditions. So it's not that ranked voting isn't fair. It's not that plurality voting isn't fair. It's not that majority voting isn't fair. It's that they're all manipulable. So they don't necessarily translate from individual preferences to the social outcome. I could very easily show you that I can get 2/3 of the voters to favor X, and without changing a single person's opinion, without tricking anybody, 2/3 will prefer X and 2/3 will prefer not X. And I can do that for any set of policies. So what is the choice of the people? If in the United States context, if 2/3 want to spend more on defense and without changing a single person's opinion, 2/3 want to spend less on defense, which is the national interest. This is very easy to show. All you have to do is draw an x-axis and a y-axis. Make there we go, the x-axis, how much to spend on defense, from very little to more. Let's say the y-axis, some other policy, trade policy, free trade, fair trade. Okay, Democrats want to spend less on defense and they want pretty much trade policy as it is. Blue-collar independents want to spend about as much on defense as is being spent, but they want trade protection. Republicans want free trade and more defense spending if the status quo is in the middle. And we say, well, anything closer to what I want than what I've got is better. So I draw an arc that goes through the status quo, centered on each of those three. So 3 arcs, each centered on one of those dots. I get a petal, overlapping arcs of 2/3 of the voters who want trade protection and less defense spending, 2/3 who want trade protection and more defense spending, 2/3 who want free trade and are happy with the trade they get. And I can move those all around. I don't need them to be equally sized groups. We have a theorem, the McKelvey-Schofield theorem, that tells us that if I have at least one more chooser than I have dimensions, issues that are linked, at least one more voter than the number of issues, there is a rational path to get a majority from any place to any place in the policy space. Any policy any policy combination can get a majority. And there's a little bit more complex theorem, the Nakamura theorem, tells us you can get 60% anywhere. So politicians are going to manipulate the coalition. Then they're going to turn around and say, well, look, 2/3 of the people agree with me. This must be the national interest. But of course, the opposition, no, wait a minute, 2/3 agree with me. It's not the national interest. And they're both right. Hello.
I think Luca has a question.
Sure.
He's sending me messages.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. So we've seen a lot of democracies in the former Soviet bloc dwindle and perish in the past few decades. Can you see a dictatorship happening in the developed world? And I have also another question. Before you mentioned that in a democracy, it depends on a group of peoples how politicians hold on to power. But wouldn't you say that the overall economic situation is more important? And a case here would be, for example, the rise and fall of Trump. He came to power because of groups of populations were left behind economically, and then he basically left the stage because of a major economic crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so I wouldn't say that the economics are more important. I would say that economics is one of the dimensions on which a clever politician can manipulate the choice of voters to form a winning coalition. So Trump's insight in the 2016 election was that there was a group of blue-collar independents who generally voted for the Democrats because the Democrats were seen as the pro-labor party. And he could construct a coalition with them by agreeing to trade protection, whereas the Republicans had been a free trade party. He could agree to trade, to tariffs and so forth, to protect them from competition, and get that portion of them who also wanted to spend more on defense and bolster national security. So that was an insight. In fact, I co-authored a book in 2007 called The Strategy of Campaigning with Condoleezza Rice while she was the sitting Secretary of State, Kyron Skinner and Seri Kudilia. The theme of the book was and is, how can politicians who are way outside the mainstream of their society win? And we looked at Ronald Reagan and we looked at Boris Yeltsin. And the basic idea was that you have to figure out what issues to put together to form a winning coalition. That was Trump's insight. He saw how to do it. He wasn't that good at it. It didn't work for him. 4 years later, he lost. But it was an insight. So I wouldn't say that economics is more important. In some elections, economics is the way to put together the coalition, and in other elections, it's not. The same economic policy that won in 2016 lost in 2020. What is important is understanding, that's really what the competition of politics is about, is understanding, how do I form a coalition? What things can I put together? In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was running for president, his great insight was that the Northwestern states and the Southern states had been aligned on tariff policy, on economics. And he had the great insight of bringing slavery into the debate, linking it to tariffs, to the economic policy, which meant now the Northwestern states at the time, which shared the South's view on tariffs, but didn't share the South's view on slavery. They shared the Northern view. Slavery was not on the agenda as the item in an earlier election. He made that coalition. That was his insight. His insight was, I can put these states on my side of the ledger instead of on the South side of the ledger. So in that case, economics took the back seat, and social policy, slavery, took abolition, took the front seat. And I lost what, in all that, I forgot what the first question was.
Yeah, the first question is, if you can imagine a dictatorship happening in the developed world today or in the next few decades?
Okay, that's a really important question. That is the theme, or a theme, of the second edition of the Dictator's Handbook, the new chapter that we're writing. And so I'm going to answer that question in two ways. No, and in special cases, yes. So no. If we say the developed world, by which I'm going to infer we mean mature democracies, Italy, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, United States, Canada. The answer is no, because, if I can get my fingers here, where the screen, there we go. So right as the winning, this way, okay. As the, I should be drawing this, get my fingers on the screen, there we go. As the coalition gets bigger, as we move from here to here, right, there's a cut point. Once we cross this cut point, because this is the small coalition area. The small coalition is always lower than the maxima for the very large coalition. Once I cross this point, I can't improve the welfare of coalition members by purging people, shrinking the coalition. In here, I can. So in here, I can get dictatorship, I can get coups, I can get revolutions, I can get all sorts of instability. But once I pass here, I can wiggle around, but I can't drop below this cut point. So I'm locked in to democracy, contrary to Marx's theory. Since mature capitalist societies are almost without exception mature democracies, and Marx thought that it was mature capitalism that would lead to revolution. The mature democracy, which intersects with mature capitalism, mature democracy is immune. I don't use the word lightly, is theoretically at least immune from revolution and coup d'etat. And in fact, so we have data for well over 200 years. My co-author and I, there has not been a single instance of a revolution or a coup once you've crossed that cut point. So the answer up there is no. The mature democracies of Europe are securely democratic. They may wiggle, but they're not going to fall. Now we talk about immature democracies, more recent, less well institutionalized. Poland, Hungary. Alistair and I are in the process of estimating this more precisely because I trained as an Indianist and I'm interested in whether India is above the cut point or below. It's right in the neighborhood. Those that are below this cut point, there is a way to improve coalition welfare by increasing the coalition or by decreasing the coalition. For any point in here, right? I can make you better off by moving up, or by purging. It's easier to move up than to purge because the people going to be purged are not going to be happy, but leaders would prefer to purge. It's better for them. So back in here, lots of instability. But once I cross that cut point, in my view, in the theory's view, there is essentially no risk of the loss of democracy. Donald Trump tried, couldn't do it. Berlusconi tried, couldn't do it. Anyway, I shouldn't pick on individual politicians. They would all like to make their countries more autocratic if they could. Some would just feel transparent.
Maybe a follow-up question, if I may.
Sure.
What variables would need to change for this to happen in a modern democracy, in a developed democracy?
Do you want to be a dictator, Luca?
So it's a really very interesting question. Within the Selectorate theory, as it currently exists, we have to move where this cut point is. So that's what Alistair and I are working on at the moment. That's exactly what we are currently thinking about. That's a really, really, really hard problem. So we have some thoughts about it. We have, in a set of recent papers, moved to so in the Selectorate world, as you've seen it, I assume you haven't read some of the more recent technical papers, leaders allocate resources between public goods and private goods, and whatever's left over is at their discretion. But we have begun to move to a world where there are three types of goods: public goods, private goods, and club goods. Club goods, well, give an example. A club good is a good that benefits a group, a club of people. So if you're in the club, it's a public good to the club. Everybody in the club gets it. But if you're outside the club, you don't get it. So it's, in that sense, private. You don't have access to it. So for example, when Catalan was made an official language in Spain, opening government jobs to Catalan speakers, then if you were in the Catalan club, you were Catalan, you now had access to government jobs that you didn't have access to before, a club good. So the coalition, the winning coalition, the essential group, can be made up in this more elaborate version of the theory of individuals and of groups, blocks of interests. Blocks of interests have interesting effects. They distort the economy in very specific ways, because now what happens is that instead of favoring individuals with corruption opportunities and so forth, you're now favoring clubs or groups of people who are organized as a voting bloc. So that means that you're spending a disproportionate amount of money to benefit that group to keep their loyalty. But how much is a complex problem? Because, of course, as a leader, you want as much discretionary money as possible. So if the group bids up the price, there'll be individuals. If there are individuals who can substitute for the group, you'll go to the individuals, keep the price down. So the blocks will have to keep their price, so the total government spending shouldn't change, because you can always go to the cheaper individuals. But the block changes what you're spending on, and that may alter the welfare function. And that may move where the cut point is. But that's all. So we've proven the parts about getting block support and so forth. We've not yet done a proof on whether or not and how, if at all, it moves where the cut point is, which would, if we can do that, that will answer the question. Unfortunately, this is once you introduce block voting or block choosing, it's a much more mathematically complicated problem. Well, if you're interested in reading it, we have 2 papers in the Journal of Theoretical Politics, 2017, and maybe 18 or 19, and a paper that's a toy model of this in the British Journal of Political Science in 2012. So the toy model is very simple, and then the 2 papers in the Journal of Theoretical Politics do it in a very general setting, and the math is pretty hard.
I just got past 2 questions. These are the last 5 questions. Thank you so much for your time. So the first one is, well, after all we've said, does democracy exist? That's one. And the second one would be, what defines democracy?
Yeah. So in the way I think about the world, words like democracy and autocracy have no meaning. So, you know, we have a sort of a general understanding that there's a difference between how North Korea operates, how Russia operates, how China operates, how Britain operates. But we also understand that there are differences between how Britain works, how Italy works, and how Germany works. We call them all democracy. So I don't find the term helpful, because inevitably, if I say this place is a democracy and that place is not, somebody says to me, why did I draw the line there? How do I know? Well, I don't know. But if I say every organization, including every government, but every organization, corporations, book clubs, all organizations can be located in a 2-dimensional space of the size of the Selectorate and the size of the winning coalition, then if you show me 2 dots in that space, I can tell you, I can make predictions about how those 2 organizations will differ in their corruption, in their public goods or private goods provision, and how well they do for their general membership compared to the inner circle, whether it's a multinational corporation, it's a government, it's a university, whatever. I can answer that question, and I can answer that for any set of dots that you put in that space. If you say to me, okay, here's a bunch of countries that are democratic, here's a bunch that are not, I can answer the question in a very general sense, if you've categorized in a way that is compatible with how I think about it. So I can say, yeah, Britain and Italy and France, Germany is going to be less corrupt than Russia, or China, or Nigeria, or, by the way, India, although it's a democracy, but it has block voting. It is the inspiration for the group modeling. So I can say that generally, but if you say, okay, well, how do I compare Germany and England? Okay, I can locate those two dots and I can answer that question. But you say, well, they're both democracy. To me, that doesn't mean anything. Likewise for autocracy. You are muted. You are muted.
So you're practically saying that the institutional approach is meaningless almost.
No. This is
usually we study
is an institutional approach. I'm saying that the way the institutional approach was pursued for a long time has been supplanted. That the institutional perspective as it originated, talking about these categorical regime types, for example, provided some useful broad brush distinctions, but now we can make much finer distinctions, and making finer distinctions is valuable. So, and we can do that without adding a lot of assumptions. It's not that we have to give up parsimony. We can have a very parsimonious theoretical representation. So we can derive the predictions from sort of the standard institutional approach to regimes. We can derive all of their implications, but we can derive much finer implications.
I have to ask you another question because it's so interesting. I mean, so instead of defining a democracy as a place that has separated powers, the division of power, and the rule of law, how would you define a democracy?
Okay.
So would you define it using different, I don't even know what to say. Like, how would you define it?
Rather, what I would say is something like the following. As the winning coalition gets bigger, both in size and as a proportion of the Selectorate, so I have to spend more on public goods. And as a leader who wants to survive in power, my initial inclination on public goods will be things like elementary education, make people literate so they can work and generate income for me. But as my coalition gets bigger, so I've already done that, I've already provided basic health care so workers can go out and make money, work and pay taxes and make money for me. As my coalition gets bigger and I have to produce more of these goods, I start to move towards things that we've called coordination goods, like free speech, freedom of assembly, free press. As we get up higher on the public goods front, we as an outcome, we produce, for example, rule of law, protection of property rights, and so on. So, whereas some people define democracy by it has rule of law, it has free and fair elections, blah, 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 that to me is not satisfying. Those are results. So what I want is to be able to predict who's going to have free and fair elections, who's going to have more or less rule of law, who's going to do a better or worse job at enforcing contracts or property rights, or allowing people to assemble to complain about the government. Those are all consequences that follow in the Selectorate theory from the size of the winning coalition. So they are things, they are results, not assumptions. So a lot of the earlier institutional work conflated the institutions and their results. It's one of my complaints about, for example, the polity index of governments, 21-point scale, that some of which is institutional, great, some of which is behavioral. But I want to explain the behavior. I don't want to define a state by the behavior that I'm interested in explaining. That's a tautology. I want to have a theory that tells me, okay, if these conditions hold, I'm going to get this behavior. And if those conditions hold, I'm going to get that behavior. And that's what the selector theory, in part, gives me. It allows me to make those predictions. So I use words like democracy and autocracy only because in common parlance, it's things that people think they understand. In the actual research, and we emphasize this in the Dictator's Handbook, we use it because people think they know what it is. We talk about winning coalitions, selectorates, and so forth, because we have very precise predictions for any combination of sizes of those groups, of those variables. And they predict the outcomes of interest, like will the election be rigged or will it be free? Will there be rule of law or will the courts be open to bribes? Or will the executive ignore the rulings of courts and be open to bribes? These are things that are to be explained, not to be assumed as the definition of the state. What's then left of interest to explain?
As my last question, I would like to ask you if what do you think are the three main or the three core concepts of your book? The three things you'd like all your readers to remember?
Well, I'd like
it's a very difficult question.
I'd like them to remember that the size of these two institutions, the Selectorate and the winning coalition, are powerful predictors of hundreds of phenomena in politics, domestic and foreign. So we don't need these categories that assume answers. So I'd like them to understand that that's in my view, a better way to think about politics. And I think it's better for people to remember that leaders are interested in their own welfare, not in our welfare, that it's the view of the world that assumes that leaders are doing what's good for the people is a naive view of the world that is going to lead to a lot of disappointment. Democratic leaders do what's good for the people because they depend on a very large number of people to keep them in power. It's not that Kim Jong-un doesn't understand that he's harming the people of North Korea. He's doing great. Things are really great for Kim Jong-un. He is alleged to have inherited $4 billion from his father in a country where the gross domestic product is only around $20-25 billion. He owns a fifth to a quarter of it. It's outrageous. It's great for him. He's not looking skinny. It's not that he doesn't understand. It's not that he's against helping the people of North Korea. It's just that he has to keep his generals loyal or they'll get rid of him. He has to keep the civil service, the senior civil servants loyal because the Bureau 35 guarantees the flow of money to him. So if he wants to stay in power, he has to satisfy that set of people. And if he instead spends the money to benefit the people, he's going to be out. So I want people to remember that. I want them to remember that leaders do what keeps them in power. And what keeps them in power depends on how big is their coalition and how big is the pool from which that coalition is drawn. If they remember that and they think seriously about it, everything falls into place in politics. They want to know why corporate executives get paid such outrageously huge amounts of money. The answer lies in how many people do they need to keep them in power. They don't need all the shareholders. The shareholders throw in their proxies. They don't know who the candidates are. They know nothing about how the firm is run. It's a few institutional investors, the insiders on the board. That's who keeps the CEO and so forth in power. That's who they have to satisfy. They get big bonuses. They get big pay for being on the board, and the CEO gets a lot of money. It's a scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's how it works. That's more than three things, but that's what I want people to remember.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
And if you have any follow-up questions, send me email.
I wrote them down.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.